Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast, episode 154. Today I'm joined with Dr. Michael Bonner to discuss his new book on the history of the Sassanid Empire.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, the first and simplest question is, where and when was the Sassanid Empire?
We're basically talking the beginning of the 3rd century, probably in the middle of the 220s is when the Sasanian dynasty comes to power, and it falls in the year 651. So this is the period often called Late Antiquity. It coincides with some very important episodes in Roman history, notably the reforms of Diocletian, the rise of Constantine, the reign of Justinian, and of course culminates in the rise of Islam. So to understand the life of the Sasanian Empire is also to understand some of the most important events in world history.
And one thing that came through quite strongly in your book is this discussion of the Sassanid Empire's relations with the powers around it. What were the key players in the geopolitics of sort of the region around Iran/Persia at this time?
The first and most obvious one is Rome. You have from comparatively early time, you have the steady rise of Roman power until it comes to dominate the Mediterranean world, and Rome's expansion eastward through Asia Minor and beyond begins to encroach upon Iranian territory, and a history of the period could well take the form of the a narrative of the constant warfare between the two powers, Rome and Persia, and sort of seemingly endless jockeying for small comparative advantages along their frontier, running south down from the Caucasus into the Arabian Peninsula. But of course, that isn't the whole story. Iran is open to, as we might say, open to Central Asia. There are few natural boundaries in the Iranian East, and the other great powers of the day were a succession of nomadic empires of the Asiatic steppe, beginning in very early times with the Scythians and the Huns. And the Huns were eventually replaced by a group of people called the Shahnameh, and the famous sort of sub-Hunnic groups of the Hephthalites and Kidarites, who themselves are eventually overthrown by the Turks. All of these nomadic powers, at one time or another, Iran had to face directly. Of course, the most famous of these, the Huns, also played a role in overthrowing Roman power, or at least very seriously threatening it for a long time. But as I say, Iran confronted them directly. Further to the east, of course, we have China, ruled by successive native and foreign dynasties, and we have some records of diplomatic contact between Iran and of some of those dynasties. And of course, famously, the very last Sasanian king, Yazgard III, famously, although we can't verify it, famously made an entreaty to the Chinese emperor for help against the Arab invasions in the 7th century. And of course, the last descendants of the Sasanian family and some Iranian nobles as well fled to China in the end and eventually became absorbed into the Tang aristocracy. So I would say that it's important to think of these. It's important to think of these great powers as more of a system, I guess you could say, rather than in isolation. And I tried to bring that out in the book. Foreign policy, Iranian foreign policy vis-a-vis of the steppe powers, I think, played a huge role in shaping the history of the Sasanian state, and was far more influential on the Empire of Iran than it was on, say, Roman power. And I think a convincing parallel can be drawn between Sasanian steppe policy and that of China in both in cultural interactions and exchanges with the steppe. I'm thinking of things like trade and the sort of famous Silk Route and so forth, as well as warfare. So I certainly hope that I brought that out in the book.
Yeah. So, building on that somewhat, there's quite a heavy focus on geopolitics. I mean, why is this? Why is geopolitics so important to our understanding of the Sassanids?
Well, I'll answer that in sort of a roundabout way. I had a point to make with that, and that is that historically, scholars have greatly underestimated the capacity of the Iranian state, not only in warfare against Rome, but also in its diplomatic capabilities. Let me give you an example. There's a scholar who's probably not much cited anymore, but he was once very highly regarded, Jakob Burckhardt, who wrote an influential book at the time called, I think, The Age of Constantine the Great. His point about the Iranian Empire was that he believed it was decentralized, that it was comparable to a feudal monarchy, that it didn't have a standing army, and that its success in the field against Rome, for example, could be attributed only to Roman failure, not to any kind of strategic or military capability on the part of Persia. I think that this is, basically, this is completely wrong. But also the capacity for things like military infrastructure, the building of fortresses and walls. We didn't, for a very long time, we didn't have the archaeological understanding to be able to evaluate the Sasanian state's capacities for these things. Now we do. And notions of things like trade with the outside world were not very well understood. Now I think, though, it's very clear, looking at both written sources and material culture, that the Sasanian state was faced with what shall we say? It had a very vulnerable continental position, unlike say Rome, for example, which was largely insulated by geography and notably the Mediterranean Sea. Iran was open to the steppe. It shared a border with its long border with its chief Western rival, Rome. And so it had to face two very serious threats on its eastern and western flanks. Now, I would say that a state that was able to hold its own against both the powers of the steppe and against the Roman military, certainly far more capable than I think scholars have traditionally assumed. And it also evinces when you think of things like military infrastructure, fort building in Mesopotamia, the massive wall that was constructed east of the Caspian Sea along the plain of Gorgan, and other fortresses that we have found further to the east. To me, that evinces a strong, centralized government as well, capable of not only organizing the manpower and materials to build these things, but also, organizing and paying a considerable military force as well. So I think there was a little bit of myth busting there. But also, going back to Iran's geographical position, I think that it's important to recognize that that the strategic, how shall I put this, the strategic isolation of Iran is something. It is shaped by geography. It is a problem that all Iranian states, or all states based in the Iranian plateau, have faced and will face. Um, I guess the only other thing I would add to that is that we have a problem. We have a problem of sources that very, very little of what we might call indigenous Iranian history has survived outside things like rock inscriptions and material culture. There's no Sasanian equivalent of the Roman historiographical tradition. There's no Iranian Thucydides or anything like that. So that means that we often have to look outside the Sasanian world for historical material, and looking at the cultures that interacted directly with Sasanian Iran, usually in the form of warfare, uh, can provide, I think, valuable clues to understand what was going on and to fill that gap. So something of a complex answer, but that's basically why I did that. And of course, looking at the Asiatic steppe, we have to, uh, uh, there are practically no sources written by nomadic powers themselves, and by far the most informative ones come from China. Unfortunately, I don't read any Chinese, but many of them have been translated. So you know looking at the history of this period, I think one is basically forced to look abroad quite often, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I'm about to ask just a little further question about the sources. Obviously, there are certain disadvantages to not having "quote unquote" indigenous sources, but
Mhm.
I mean, in one sense, what are the advantages of that? And on the flip side of that, what do we wish we had?
Mm. Well, okay. So this is what I would say when we say when we talk about the theory or the concept of an indigenous Sasanian source. Often, what that means to people, and certainly what it meant to me when I first became interested in this field, would be something like a chronicle or some kind of documentary source produced at the level of the Sasanian court, or by the Sasanian bureaucracy or something like that. That would mean a Zoroastrian source associated with the government. That's more or less what I think most scholars would assume by an indigenous Sassanian source. Now, we don't have any of those. There are some theories about how a royal chronicle might have survived or been recycled later on, which I can, or in Islamic times, which I can get into in a moment. But there is nothing. Well, I shouldn't say nothing. There's very little that has survived in the way of such an official source. However, there are indigenous Sassanian sources in the form of things like saints' lives or ecclesiastical histories produced by Iranian Christians. There is an excellent tradition of Armenian historiography, which is also comes from a Christian community, but which is nevertheless from the Iranian world. A great part of Armenia was firmly within the Sasanian world. There are Georgian chronicles as well. Iberia was also part of the Sasanian Empire, but those those are, although they contain excellent information, they are largely hostile to the ruling house. They are critical of Zoroastrian triumphalism. They portray the efforts of the how should I put this? They portray the religious policy of the court in an entirely hostile light. And although I think that such sources are largely informative and useful, we often have to take them with a grain of salt. Same goes for the external sources from the Roman world. That they are, they first of all, they rarely take an interest in Iranian affairs unless they impinge directly on the Roman world, which means that we are often limited to accounts of warfare or diplomatic exchanges and so forth. But when a lot of these historians, such as say Procopius or Agathias, turn to descriptions of the Sasanian Empire and their religion and so forth, they're more or less depending on recycled Hellenistic cliches, and they make very little effort to understand the Iranian world of their own day. So, to get back to the idea of an indigenous source, if we had something like this produced by the Sasanian court itself, we would have arguably a more balanced view, or at least we would have their own. We would have the Sasanians' own perspective on a lot of these matters. Now, there was a theory that held sway for a very long time, going back to a scholar by the name of Nuldeke. He argued that there was indeed an official chronicle produced at the by under the patronage of the court, that was sort of how would you say, sort of like semi-mythical, that it tells the whole history of it tells all of the Iranian history from the beginning of time all the way up to the present day, and that this was at some point translated into Arabic after the Islamic conquest, and that this Chronicle is ultimately what lies behind the later Arabic and Persian accounts of Iranian history. Most famously, the Iranian national epic called the Shahnameh was long held to repose upon such a chronicle. Now, in my previous work before I wrote this book, this historiographical problem was my chief interest. I don't think that there was such a chronicle, or at least this tradition, this historiographical tradition. I don't think it goes back to a single document. I think that there is. I think that the evidence suggests that there were a variety of different texts. There were, maybe some official. There may have been some official information circulating about the chief accomplishments, or the sort of uh, main achievements of the Sasanian kings, along with how long they reigned, the cities they built, stuff like that, but nothing that would rise above the level of a very sort of dry and basic uh, chronicle, as well as things like romances or family histories, sort of quasi mythical uh, accounts of the deeds, the sort of like heroic and chivalric deeds of various kings, accounts of feasting and that sort of thing, um, battles, what have you. And these anecdotes do crop up in the later literature as well. You have a blend of of uh, fable and solid history in the accounts of people like Tabari, Dinawari, and the Shahnameh, all of which were written hundreds of years after the fall of the Sasanian state. So, uh, it's a controversial question to what extent historians can use these texts to reconstruct the past. Um, I am largely skeptical of these traditions. I think that there's a lot in them that um, doesn't really, you know, sort of defies common sense, and it involves sort of magical and sort of Arabian Nights style happenings and so forth. But if you exclude all that, there's actually a great deal that can be corroborated through other sources. But to go back to your original question, what the problem that we are faced with is that even when it comes to the theory of the recycling or the survival of some kind of native historiographical tradition, we're still somewhat remote from the actual Sasanian period, because all of this has been filtered through. I'm not sure what the right metaphor is, but it's come to us recycled in a translation, first of all, and through the lens of Islam. So there's very little what I would recognize as authentically Zoroastrian content, and the way that the information is presented is often the reigns of the Sasanian kings and the whole life of the dynasty are presented as a kind of prelude to the coming of Islam. That it's all sort of the actual uh, uh, real history is subordinated to a much grander and larger narrative of what we might call salvation history. So I would say we have to be very careful about how we use these texts. But on the whole, I would say that bearing in mind, or while still exercising some skepticism, I would say that we can use them, and that there are some things that we would not know if we didn't. And in the absence of something like official records or an actual historiographical tradition that we can confidently date to that period, we basically don't have a choice. We have to take a leap of faith and use these sources one way or the other.
So what was brought up quite a lot was the religion in these sources, that there's Islam and Zoroastrianism and even Christianity. What was the religious landscape like in Iran at this time, and how did it change?
So the Sasanian the appearance of the Sasanian dynasty is associated with what we might call the uh, the paradigm of a single established religion. That is an oversimplification, but that is often how it's thought of, and it is similar. Choosing my words carefully, it's similar in principle to what occurred in the Roman Empire with Christianity shortly after the appearance of the Sasanian family. The From what we can tell based on the relics of Zoroastrian scripture that have survived, the Zoroastrian perspective was that the ancient Zoroastrian religion had been sort of ticking along nicely during the first Iranian Empire under the Achaemenid monarchy, and everything was well and good until the conquest by Alexander the Great, who is credited with incinerating the Zoroastrian scriptures, burning down Persepolis, the Persian capital, and basically severely disrupting the religion to the point where there was a great deal of confusion as to what was orthodox and what wasn't, and all sorts of evil consequences are attributed to this. In real history, we then have the appearance of the so-called Parthian or Arsacid state. These are the people who famously killed Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae, and it's something of an controversial question as to what sort of religion, if any, they really adhered to, the Arsacids. But according to Zoroastrian scripture, it was Ardashir, the first Sasanian king, who restored the old religion. And we have these accounts of writing the scriptures down again after a long period of oral transmission, of reestablishing the Zoroastrian priestly hierarchy, and so forth. So, if we trust this account, which is a Zoroastrian one itself, based on what we have left of Zoroastrian scripture, it would seem that the Sasanian state had a single established religion, which was under the patronage of the monarchy. That is, I would suggest, that is probably how the Sasanians themselves wished it to appear, but I don't think that it is entirely true. There was, of course, from a very, very ancient period, there was a Jewish community in Iran. There were all sorts of other sects that we could name: Manichaeism, um, various sorts of heterodox Jewish beliefs, Buddhism, um, Mandaism. We could probably compose a long list of this, and of course, eventually Christianity in a variety of different forms. Um, these communities were, of course, small minorities at first, but eventually grew, and it eventually came to the point in probably well, actually, first in the fifth century, we have a sort of watershed moment at which the Sasanian king Yasgard the First grants toleration to the Christian minority, and this comes after um, what is portrayed as a long period of persecution. I think that there was a persecution. Some people debate this. Um, the the Syrian Christian sources themselves probably exaggerate the severity of the persecution, but I think that there's some kernel of truth there. And to my way of thinking, this means that the Christian community, by about the middle of the fifth century, had become sufficiently numerous that it made very little sense to continue to persecute them. And from there, it continues to grow until in the sixth and seventh centuries, there's evidence of a large community of high-ranking Christians serving the king directly. You have evidence of the royal court taking an interest in the appointment of bishops, the summoning of church councils along the lines of a Roman emperor, and there are even rumors, which are not true, but there are many of them, to the effect that the Sasanian king had actually converted to Christianity. In fact, there in some of the later Islamic chronicles dealing with Persia, we actually find that a myth of one of Christ's apostles appearing at the court of Ardashir, the first Sasanian king. This is, of course, chronologically impossible, but nevertheless, they say so. And there are rumors of angels and Jesus himself appearing in visions or dreams to various Sasanian kings at certain points, which again, it's hard to sort of guess what this may mean, but I think it's certainly evidence of the political importance of the Christian community within the Sasanian Empire, and probably efforts on the part of the court to ensure their loyalty, which again would suggest by toward the end of the Sasanian period that there are simply too many Christians to justify any sort of further persecution, or even any kind of notion of secondary status in comparison with Zoroastrians. And it may even be possible to argue that the how shall I say this, that the Sasanian state encouraged the loyalty, or at some point began to encourage the loyalty of its Christian subjects in a way that would have paralleled the sort of the use of Zoroastrianism as an ideological support for the state, if that makes any sense.
And Just digressing briefly, what sort of Christianity was being practiced in Iran at this time? Because it seems that it wasn't quite the same as what you'd have found in the Roman Empire.
Right. That's a good question. So in the early days of the Sasanian state, there would have been many different Christian communities who uh, might have had their a single town or village might have had more than one bishop. The evidence seems to suggest that, and this suggests there doctrinal differences that we probably will never really be able to grasp what they were. But as Christian theology began to be codified in the Roman Empire, you also have the same trends within Iran. And without getting too deep into the theological problems, this is going to be a gross oversimplification. That Iranian Christianity tended to favor what was traditionally, but probably improperly, called Nestorianism. Nestorius was himself, I believe, of Syrian origin, who became Patriarch of Constantinople. And he had a doctrine in which he wanted to separate the two natures of Christ, the divine and the human, and to stress that put emphasis on the real life and humanity of Christ. Um, this this doctrine, as it seems, and again I have to say seems because these accounts, the account of the development of doctrine, Christian doctrine within the Sasanian Empire, is written from a hostile perspective. But from the perspective of so-called Orthodox Christians, it was the Nestorian doctrine that eventually prevailed within the Sasanian Empire, and of course it was condemned at Rome. So it might be possible to see in that distinction um, the uh, the influence of the Persian court in favoring a non-Roman form of Christianity. But that's subject to some debate. Um, but I guess what I would say also is that you have not only you have the same sort of cultural distinctions within Christianity, or almost the same cultural distinctions within Iranian Christianity as you do within Roman Christianity. You have Armenian and Georgian Christians within Iran, as well as Syrian ones. And many of the theological trends, as I said before, within Rome would have percolated uh, within those communities also. So although the Sasanian court might have favored the so-called Nestorian doctrine for its patronage of a kind of officially tolerated form of the religion, that there would have been other communities also that they would have had to interact with and to manage. Um, as for um, well, I don't want to get too deeply into the doctrinal stuff, but there's an important um, moment toward the it's in the first decade of the 7th century that there's the last war between Rome and Persia has just broken out, and of course the plan is to conquer the Roman Empire, a community, an empire of mostly Christians who adhere to a different uh, different doctrine than the ones in Iran. And you can see or almost perceive the sort of foreign policy at work of the court. The king deposes the patriarch of Ctesiphon, who would have been considered a Nestorian, and leaves the see leaves that episcopal see open, and switches the switches the royal favoritism from Nestorianism to what we now call monophysitism, the sort of the opposite uh, doctrine, and the doctrine held at the time by the majority of Roman Christians. So, to me, as I argue in the book, this is a signal that that ecclesiastical politics featured, that they were a very important feature of Iranian foreign policy, and became even more important when it came to the plan to annex Roman territory, and the future plan of ruling over a much larger population of Christians. So somewhat long-winded, but I hope there's an answer in there.
Yeah. So, I mean, another religious movement that appears, apart from, well, there are two that really caught my eye. The first were the Manichaeans, and the second were the Mazdakites. Obviously, not to digress too much from where we want to go, but could you just discuss a little bit about sort of how these emerged, what they were on about, and why there seems to have been such opposition to them?
Two fascinating topics. So, Manichaeism first. So, Manichaeism is a kind of syncretic blend of Zoroastrian, Buddhist, Christian, maybe some Jewish ideas. It's arguably an attempt to establish a kind of universal religion, which unsurprisingly crops up at exactly the same time when Christianity is about to make the jump from a persecuted sect to the official religion of the Roman Empire. Manichaeism comes from Mesopotamia, from within the Iranian Empire. It supposedly is informed by Mani. He's the founder of it. Mani's journey to India. So it's an international movement and so forth. And Mani himself, we're talking the very early days of the Sasanian state. Mani himself seems to have won over a considerable amount of. He seems to have acquired a considerable amount of influence over relatives of the Sasanian king, and probably other nobles as well. He runs afoul of the Sassanian religious policy, which is, as far as I can tell, is to basically ensure the uniformity of Zoroastrian practice, not so much belief, but practice within the lands ruled by the Sassanian king. The chief architect of this policy seems to have been a Zoroastrian priest by the name of Kerdir, who attained considerable influence over Shapur the First, the son of the founder of the Sasanian state, and his successors as well. Kerdir is one of the very few non-royal personages who has left an inscription describing his deeds, life and times, and so forth. And he boasts of basically promoting the Zoroastrian religion and ensuring that temples are well maintained, and he claims to have founded several. And he also claims to have persecuted I mean, it's debatable what this actually means, persecution, but he claims to have, cracked down on Christianity and Manichaeism. Um, Now, what's interesting is that Kerdir and Mani, based on the inscription of Kerdir and the relics of Manichae scripture that have survived, they both make sort of similar claims. They had visions of heaven and hell. They claimed to have a kind of spiritual counterpart. Mani calls it the twin. Sort of questionable what that means, but it's some kind of, it's clearly pointing to spiritual trends of the day. And in the end, although Manichaeism survived in some form, especially in the Roman Empire, in the end, the Sasanian state and Kerdir himself were victorious. Mani was supposedly put to death, and the official toleration or potential patronage of Manichaeism was withdrawn, and the state remained officially Zoroastrian. But what I mean, if we think about the sort of overall spiritual trend at the time, we have the growth of these universal religions who are attempting to sort of solidify doctrine. They make exclusive claims for their adherents, and even though Manichaeism is kind of a blend of other ideas and seems to be in some way more I don't know what you would say, flexible than other religions. You still have this trend towards solidifying doctrine and the idea of establishing a universal religion. And this is a kind of glimpse, I think, of that trend. And in the outcome of the contest, the Manichaees were unsuccessful. The same seems to go for the Mazdakites. Now, exactly what Mazdakism was, whether it's a kind of Zoroastrian heresy or an alternative religion, or some kind of Zoroastrian movement that appeared orthodox at the time but was later condemned. We don't really know. We know from Zoroastrian scripture that Mazdak is, a figure of hatred, and he's universally condemned. He's accused of having had a disastrous influence on the Sasanian king Kavod I, who reigned in the late 5th and for the early part of the 6th century. And his son Khosrow Anushirvan is credited with having dealt with him and killed him. The problem with this period is a very good illustration of the problems with our sources. That there is no independent evidence outside the Iranian royal tradition that Mazdak even existed. The one contemporary Roman source that mentions anything about the religious affairs of this period refers to a sect under the name the Zaradushtaqan, who apparently preached a kind of communism with the sharing of possessions and the sharing of wives. That does sound like Mazdakism as described in other sources, but there's no mention of Mazdak. So exactly who he was, or exactly what he did, is a matter of some doubt. The Iranian royal tradition makes some very, very aggressive claims about what Mazdakism did, and the sources attribute to it all sorts of chaos and confusion, a massive disruption of the Iranian social order, communal intercourse, sharing of holding property in common and things like this. If you if you ask me, I would say that a lot of the material culture that has survived in the form of things like aristocratic ceilings and so forth, it really suggests that there was not much of a disruption. I mean, there's in fact there's no independent evidence of any kind of serious disruption. The same, Mazdakism is often thought of as an attempt to undermine noble and clerical power. The evidence of ceilings proves that the same noble houses were holding power after the supposed disaster as before. So, it's somewhat doubtful as to what actually happened. However, there's at least one Islamic sect that flourished, in the Abbasid era, called the Khorramites. Khorram is a Persian word meaning happy, and this sect is usually, or I don't know about usually, it has sometimes been considered a kind of that it was inspired by Mazdakism, that it was a kind of a holdover of Mazdakism. I don't know whether they held their wives in common or shared all their possessions in a kind of communist manner, but they seem to have traced their lineage back to Mazdak. So whatever happened at the sort of late 5th, early 6th century seems to have had some kind of lasting influence, but it doesn't seem to have been quite as bad as what the sources suggest. So, as I say in my book, I think I compare Mazdakism to a kind of morass that you just sort of get caught in. But it is one of the most mysterious topics in late antiquity, and the only other thing that I would note about it is that it attracted a kind of obsessional interest from Soviet scholars, because it was considered a kind of proto-communism or something, a kind of like Marxist movement, and a lot of Soviet scholars tried to infer these kind of like the breakdown of the peasant commune and the kind of proletarian revolution, and Mazdak was a kind of Lenin-like figure. I think that's kind of overly imaginative, but that's there's a huge body of scholarship like that. If anyone is bold and patient enough to force their way through it.
So I'd like to move, not necessarily chronologically, but just look at a few major events that happened during the Sassanid era, at least sort of as far as my understanding goes. Obviously, the first thing is that the Sassanids succeed the Arsacids. How much do the Sassanids sort of inherit from the Arsacids? How much does it seem that the Sassanids were actively actually trying to cover up the Arsacid legacy?
Very good question. So I think that in many ways the succession of Ardashir it doesn't really
mark a fundamental change from the Arsacid era. That Roman sources, although they notice that there has been a revolution of sorts and that there's a new king, it's not really there's no obvious sense in which something fundamental has changed in terms of the identity of Iran or some such thing. Now, it could well be said that that's exactly the sort of thing that Roman historians would not pay attention to, but I don't. I mean, even if you consider just from a chronological perspective, I don't think that there would have been enough time for Ardashir to achieve any kind of, really heavy-going reform of the state or military or something like that. But what he did do is he reestablished, or I guess he ratcheted up a policy of warfare in the West, and aimed to take back, as it were, territories held by Rome, which had formerly belonged to the Achaemenid monarchy, and at some points perhaps to the Arsacid Empire as well. And the warfare suddenly becomes much more aggressive. What does begin to happen, though, and it's debatable as to to what extent Ardashir was able to achieve this and how far he got and what his successors did, is that the Sasanian state becomes significantly more centralized than the Arsacid one was. That the Arsacid Empire is probably, I mean, these comparisons are anachronistic, but the Arsacids are always compared to a kind of feudal monarchy, that you have a king at the top, but then all these sort of other sub kings with varying degrees of comparative prestige and different privileges, different insignia, you know, their own armies and so forth. Chief amongst these sort of sub kings, though, as far as we can tell, was the king of Armenia. He was the sort of second in command to the. I'm not sure what the right metaphor is. He's the number two guy in the empire. You also have the rule of or the presence of aristocratic families who have special privileges before the king as well. We don't know who these all were. We don't know how many there were. Some of them are mentioned in Roman sources. The general at the Battle of Carrhae, who defeated Crassus, his name, according to Plutarch, was Surena. That's the Parthian or Persian name Surain, and that family name is attested throughout Arsacid and Sasanian history also, and there were undoubtedly others, but they don't all appear in the historical record, and we don't know all what they did, what their roles were. In the case of the Surain family, it seems to have been their privilege to crown the Arsacid monarch. That when the coronation occurred, whoever the Surain patriarch was, he would bring out the crown and put it on the king's head, supposedly. When we get into the Sasanian period, it's very clear that these families, these noble houses, persist in some form. We find their aristocratic ceilings, and their names crop up in various sources. They don't always we don't always have enough information. Actually, I would say we rarely have enough information to develop a meaningful portrait of any of these people. But the point is that they persisted, and they seem to have derived their lineage from Arsacid times. Now, one important historian of Iran, her name is Parvaneh Pourshariati. She published a famous book, I think, in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, called Decline and Fall of the Sasanian Empire. And her thesis is basically that this cabal of aristocratic families of putatively Parthian origin were in a kind of pact with the Sasanian family to support the Sasanian family in exchange for some privileges of some kind, and that when the Arab conquest came and the prestige of the ruling house had begun to fail, that this pact disintegrated, and that the ruling the aristocratic houses basically sided with the Arabs. Now, I'm not entirely in agreement with that, but I think that it's very important to emphasize that the Sasanian the Sasanian dynasty still had to work with other aristocratic families, which were probably older, well, definitely older than the Sasanian house was, and they probably would have been, it probably would have been as you would expect, that they were jealous of their own lineage, and they felt that they had their own responsibilities and entitlements and so on and so on and so on. But the key difference between this arrangement and the Parthian one is that the Sasanian state becomes significantly more centralized. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a controversial idea for a long time, and for some people it still is. If you read the literary sources that have survived, you might get the idea that the Sasanian state was as decentralized as the Parthian one was, and that the descriptions of aristocratic feuds or plots against the king of the day, they might suggest a certain amount of decentralization and frankly disorder. But I don't know how to square that with the evidence of material culture that we have found, and the evidence of the performance of the Iranian military, often on multiple fronts. That the two portraits don't seem to go together, and I'm inclined to favor the material evidence and the evidence of being able to the Iranian state being able to hold its own against Rome and the steppe, and eventually to defeat Rome and annex a great part of the Roman Empire. So I mentioned material culture. What is the material culture? It's the construction of fortresses, canals, irrigation works, walls, palaces, agricultural infrastructure on a huge scale, trade, tariffs, roads. These are the hallmarks of a centralized state. And of course, then there's coinage. The Sasanian silver coins they maintained a very high standard of purity, which hardly wavered throughout the life of the dynasty. And I simply can't fathom a decentralized feudal quasi feudal state doing that. So I would say that is a stark contrast with the Arsacid era, and I myself would reject the theory of a kind of uh, uh, brittle Sasanian state held together by the surface tension between noble houses or something. That's a bit of a mixed metaphor, but I think you get the idea.
And building on that, there was the sort of centralization of the Sassanid state seems pretty clear. It's mentioned in your book that a lot of the sources tend to attribute much of the long-term success of the Sassanid state to reforms propagated under Shah Khosrow I.
Mm-hmm.
How much is this actually borne out? What were the reforms, and how much were they his?
Very good point. Very good question. So a little bit about that. A little bit about those sources. So the the Sasanian state was replaced eventually, not immediately, by uh, the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate itself replaced the Umayyad one. The Umayyad state could be called more or less an Arab one, uh, which had its capital, at Damascus in Syria. The Abbasid Caliphate, reestablishes more or less the Sasanian Empire. That is actually not a very controversial idea. The capital is moved to Baghdad, which is not that far from Ctesiphon, the old Sasanian capital, and it's under this uh, state that the real work of Muslim Islamic historiography begins, and they start looking back on the past and looking to Sasanian models for literature and statecraft and architecture, culture in general, really. Uh, so this means that a lot of the uh, practices of the administrative state uh, have Sasanian models, or were believed to have Sasanian models. So, in the case of the reforms attributed to Khusro Anushirvan, the same sort, and the reforms deal with things like taxation, farming, possibly the military, maybe, and this is the most controversial part, is maybe some kind of uh, cultural program. All of these things, especially taxation and so forth, seem, or they are portrayed as being taken over by the Abbasid Caliphate, which makes sense considering that the it's the same land, much the same sort of agricultural practices, same crops more or less, and probably a comparable population. So if the practices worked in the past, why not keep using them? Uh, but this state of affairs means that practically anything any of these practices or reforms or whatever are going to get attributed to the most prestigious and famous Sasanian king that anybody can think of, and that and for many people that was Khosrow I, the great rival to Justinian in the Roman Empire. So we're already in a position where we're not sure whether we can trust any of this, and to make matters more complicated, some sources suggest that the reforms began under Khosrow's father Kavad, and that they were, simply finished by Khosrow Anushirvan, or that he, maybe he didn't do anything, but he simply got the credit for some reason. It's conceivable. A parallel to this might be the reforms of Diocletian. The reforms, the tax reform and so forth, were certainly begun by Diocletian, but they don't really get finished, and we don't have a description of what they're like until the reign of Constantine the First. So, to what extent are we actually talking about Constantinian reforms instead of the Diocletianic ones? That's an interesting question. Same thing here. When it comes to taxation reform, it looks like an effort was made to make taxation more regular and predictable, or make the state's income more regular and predictable, instead of using payment as a percentage of yield of the farmer's crop. That payment was made in money as a fixed annual sum. Now, this sounds all well and good, but I'm inclined to doubt that there was ever a time in the life of the Sasanian Empire where people were not paying in money. I find it unlikely and quite implausible that farmers were expected to hand over a share of the crop rather than pay in coins. And the simple reason for this is that the Sasanian Empire clearly has a monetized system, has a money system from the very beginning. They made coins. We still find them all over the place. They were plentiful and they circulated widely. So I'm inclined to doubt that element of the reform. As for making the payment more predictable and regular, maybe that happened. Seems plausible, but there is no mention of any such reform in any external source. So we can't corroborate it. We either have to take our later sources' word for it, or not. What's more interesting, I think, is the military reform. Supposedly, Khosrow Anushirvan divided the chief military office into four offices, four ranks, and installed each of the four generals over a quarter of the empire, and presumably also with staff and whatever else they would need to administer the military affairs of that quarter of the empire. This is arguably paralleled by Justinian's reorganization of Roman Armenia, the military command in Roman Armenia, and it is a matter of endless debate as to which came first. There's and who influenced whom. That said, there were some scholars going back to the 50s who argued that the reforms of Khosrow Anushirvan are themselves, both the tax reform and the military side of it, they were derived from Diocletian's reforms. I just don't. I don't find that. I don't find that plausible at all. We're talking about several hundred years separating these two things. So I mean, I don't find that plausible. And if anything, the idea of a more centralized Roman state is probably inspired by the Iranian example that began under Ardashir and not the other way around. Anyway, back to the military thing. For most of the 20th century, this reform of the military and the four generals was dismissed as imaginary. That the four, dividing the empire into four, and the naming the quarters after the points of the compass. This was viewed as a literary device or a myth. Recently, however, the seals, the sealings of the four generals have been found, and this proves conclusively that it happened. There are also there's an Armenian geographical text that mentions this reform. It doesn't describe it as reform. It simply describes the state of the Iranian Empire, and it mentions the four quarters and the generals and so forth. So with that, I think we're on much safer, much surer ground than the tax reform. The purpose of this reform is probably to make the military more flexible so that it can fight on more than one front at one time. It probably worked. It arguably, I don't get into this in the book, but it's arguable that it actually, in the end, promoted the downfall of the empire, because if you have four generals, they're more likely to fight one another if they have a reason to do so. So it could be argued that it actually created conflict and exacerbated civil war toward the end of the Sasanian era. Final point about Kavad and Khusro. We know, I'm fairly confident in saying that Kavad definitely started it, but did Khusro actually finish it, or did he take credit for it? That we don't know. But there is evidence in the form of coins that the quartering of the empire started under Kavad as a kind of administrative division, for the civil service. And if that's true, and I think, it seems to be, given the evidence of coins, maybe the military reform began earlier too. And I guess you could infer from all this that a lot of what, we talked about the idea of a royal chronicle before, or the concept of an indigenous Sasanian history, that if what we actually have in our sources is one king taking credit for the work of another king and portraying himself as the author of it, that is an interesting example of basically royal propaganda coming down to us in a recycled form, or the talking points of one king, taking credit for what his predecessor did, coming down to us in later sources.
So there is, of course, a major thing that happens during the reign of Khosrow I that we've brought up, Justinian, which I think pretty much gives it away, and is kind of appropriate to the current situation at hand, which is the Justinianic plague. How does the Sasanian Empire manage to deal with it?
another fascinating question. I mean, unfortunately, the answer is that we don't know, but there are some clues that might help us sort it out. We have Roman sources that describe the effect of the plague. We have Procopius, most famously, who gives a very vivid account of its origin and spread. And we have some Syrian writers, most famously John of Ephesus, whose work gets recycled in other chronicles, who talk about the effect of the plague. But we have nothing from within Iran itself at the time. We do have a tradition in later Muslim histories describing Khusro I falling ill at this time. Doesn't exactly say the plague, but it says that he was ill, and of course Justinian himself had the plague. So that is one notice that suggests that something was wrong. There is a chronicle also called the Chronicle of Sert, which seems to recycle some Iranian Christian information about the Sasanian period, which describes in about the 550s, if I'm not mistaken, 550s, that the Iranian church is obliged to help dispose of the bodies in Ctesiphon, people who've died of the plague. So we have two clues about what happened. So the plague breaks out in the early 540s in the Roman Empire, right at the moment when there is a war raging between Rome and Persia. Khusro falls ill, and then presumably the plague is ravaging Iran at that time. And then in the 550s, it's still going on because the church is still obliged to help out with disposing of bodies. So to me, that points to, I think that's enough evidence to infer, especially compared to what's going on in the rest of the world at the time, that the plague is having a severe effect on Iran, just as it is on the Roman Empire. Beyond that, though, we don't really have anything. The illness of Khusro I is described as the pretext for a rebellion that breaks out. His son, who is surprisingly identified as a Christian in our sources, leads the rebellion, and it fails, and Khusro recovers, and the son is killed in battle. And according to the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, the Iranian national epic, the son of Khusro, whose name is Anushzad, dies the death of a martyr and is commemorated as one. So, I don't think that that's necessarily real history. I think that the rebellion is probably, I think that there probably was a rebellion. It's also mentioned by Procopius. The son may well have been a Christian. Whether he was genuinely celebrated as a martyr or not, I don't know whether that's true, but I think that that is sufficient evidence of a considerable upheaval associated with the outbreak of the plague in Iran, which I think might be worthy of more attention. And there are some stray notices in the history of Tabari, the Muslim scholar, that suggest that there were some legal reforms to deal with orphaned children in order to keep the families in order to make sure that things were properly inherited if both parents had died. And there are some reports in the same text about recruiting foreigners, foreign mercenaries into the Iranian army, which would make sense in a context in which many people had died. Uh, these are not explicitly connected with the plague. They are actually not explicitly connected with anything, but they come after Tabari's description of Mazdakism and have traditionally been interpreted to mean measures that were taken to deal with the aftermath of Mazdakism. But that isn't explicit. It isn't even like, I don't even think it's implied. I think that that's just an inference, and it might make more sense, I argue, to connect those with the outbreak of the outbreak and the effects of the plague. So that is the limit of both historical certainty and, I think, historical inference based on textual sources that we have about the plague in Iran. But there's a little bit more that I get into. First of all, the spread of the plague is a matter of some doubt. That Procopius describes himself first noticing it or the Romans first noticing it in Egypt, and then it spreads, throughout the Roman Empire from then, and that's been interpreted as a clue to mean that the plague came from from the Indian subcontinent and was brought by merchants in the Persian Gulf, and then they put down at what is now Suez, and then bring the plague further north. That may well be true, but if we consider how open Iran is to the world of the steppe, and that we now know based on DNA evidence that the plague originated in Inner Asia, in the region of the Tian Shan Mountains, what prevents us from inferring that the plague actually penetrated Iran first from the east and then was carried westward? I mean, it's not reflected in any historical sources, but the historical sources only uh, they can only reflect what people thought they observed at the time, uh, and there may be something to that idea. I don't know. It's maybe worth thinking about, but I I guess the only other point I would make here is that now that we are ourselves living through a pandemic, uh, it brings a completely different perspective, I think, to the study of the Justinianic plague. That there were two competing uh, schools of thought from a lot of the 20th century about the Justinianic plague, and they were roughly divided into the maximalists and the minimalists, and that maximalists would side with the literary evidence that there was a substantial mortality, and that the damage was as bad as or worse than described by Procopius. And the minimalists would say that Procopius and the literary sources are sort of fictionalizing an account and greatly exaggerating the real state of affairs, and that archaeological evidence does not bear out huge mortality or anything like that. But this is the thing. We can now see that even if there isn't a huge mortality, even without uh, millions upon millions of deaths, as Procopius seems to imply, that simply the fear of contagion can cripple a society. It can destroy, or well, destroy is maybe too harsh a word for what we're going through, but it can severely cripple an economy, and it can greatly undermine people's confidence. So even without a massive death toll, the Justinianic plague could still have been a very, very serious problem, which in the era before antibiotics, and before people wash their hands frequently, it would have been. I think there's now no question that it would have been devastating. Whatever its actual effects were, whatever the actual mortality was, that the effect would have been devastating. And with that in mind, we have to assume that the damage to Iran was comparable to what is described in Roman sources.
So, I'm jumping forward in time really quite considerably to another Khosrow, going sort of away from, I suppose, biological issues towards a bit more the raw geopolitics again. Um, the beginning of the 7th century sees a war between the Romans and the Sassanids that's often called sort of the last great war of antiquity. And the Sassanids seem to do very well to begin with. I mean, most of the Roman Near East is occupied. And yet at the end of it, it seems very much sort of status quo. So, why were the Sassanids so successful to begin with? Was it intended that they wanted to maintain these gains, and why in the end did everything get reversed?
Okay, well, this is probably my favorite topic. So the first answer as to why they were successful, at least at first, has two answers. The first is that the Sasanian military was simply, more than a match for Roman power, and had been for some time. But the reforms, the military reforms of Khosrow I, I think, undoubtedly put the military in an even stronger position. I mean, we know about the quartering of the empire to make, and the four generals to make everything more flexible, but there may well have been other measures that were taken that increased the firepower, as it were. The second part of it is that Persia was very fortunate to be able to take advantage of a Roman civil war at the time. The Roman sources don't exactly describe a civil war, but it's pretty obvious that that's what was going on, that you had a usurper by the name of Phocas, who overthrew the Emperor Maurice, and Maurice had already had a pre-existing relationship with Khosrow II because he had helped him when he had been faced with a usurper. Phocas's reign, was, I don't think, tolerated very well by a lot of people, and there were many aristocrats and generals in the Roman world who were keen to see the end of him, and we have evidence of generals refusing to obey Phocas when the Persians are on their way in, and the state is clearly the Roman state is clearly just too distracted to mount the kind of the kind of defense that would normally have halted the Persian advance. So those are the two main things that I would observe. Second, the other thing, though, is that the Persian advance from the beginning of the 7th century and the annexation of Rome proceeded very slowly at first. It took about a decade to actually take and hold the Roman positions in on the other side of the Euphrates, and that admits of a very simple explanation, which is that the Roman fortifications in that area, which had begun under Diocletian, were formidable barriers to the Iranian advance, and they didn't hold out in the end, but they certainly slowed down the advance and the occupation. Once once those defenses were overcome, though, it was a fairly swift process thereafter. And the most notable features of the war after this are the Persian uh, uh, destruction, or quote unquote destruction, of Jerusalem in the year 615, the conquest of Roman Egypt beginning, I believe, in 619, and the siege, the Persian and Avar siege of Constantinople in I believe the year 626. Very, very memorable. Well, memorable if you remember it, but events of high significance in Roman and world history in that war. The original plan was simply to push the Romans back as far beyond the Euphrates as could be managed, at the same time as aiming to overthrow the usurper Phocas and to replace him with a person who is portrayed in uh, uh, non-Roman sources as the legitimate and real son of the previous emperor, Maurus. This is a young man by the name of Theodosius, who in several sources actually is described as having fled to Iran, to the court of Khosrow II, and was crowned rightful Roman emperor in Ctesiphon on the eve of the Persian invasion of Roman territory. So that was the plan, to install this guy as emperor, maybe as a client king or maybe as an independent one, who knows? But that seems to have been the plan. At some point, though, toward the year 615, it seems as though Khosrow II and his advisors changed their mind, that there was no point in they must have reasoned there was no point in installing this guy on the throne if they could just take and hold Roman territory themselves, and they may as well have liquidated the Roman state for good. And that seems to have been exactly what they decided to do. This operation was meant to culminate in a siege of Constantinople, uh, in cooperation with a group of nomads called the Avars, who seem to have fled from the borders of China, being pursued by the Turks, and who had set up shop in I don't know what you would call it, Thrace, or Pannonia and Thrace or something. Not the area in and around Hungary, I guess. They were to march southward and to begin the siege of Constantinople from the north, and Persian forces were going to blockade it from the south, possibly by sea. In the event, this is not what ended up happening. The naval blockade never occurred, and the Avar siege of Constantinople was simply unsuccessful. They did not manage to get through the walls, which is a testament to how strong they were. The walls obviously are very old now, but they were, they're extremely old now, but they were very old even then. They had obviously been kept in good repair. And before the age of gunpowder, nothing seemed to get through them. So that siege failed. Now, at that point, the Sasanian state could have said, look, we'll let you maintain a sort of Roman rump state based in Constantinople, and we'll take the rest. And the Romans might well have agreed to that. It's an interesting counterfactual, but the emperor at the time, whose name was Heraclius, he had overthrown the usurper Phocas and had made it his mission to sort of retrieve Roman fortunes. He led an astonishing counterattack that took the fight right to right into Iranian territory, through Armenia, into the Caucasus, and down into the vicinity of Ctesiphon. And the effect of this counterattack was to put a great deal of pressure on the Sasanian state. And by this point, the war had been going on for almost 30 years. There was obviously considerable fatigue, as there always is, from warfare, and it seems as though that the noble houses of Iran had simply had enough of this, and they killed Khusro II in the middle of the night, the end of February, and replaced him with his son, who also had the backing of the Roman Emperor Heraclius, which is evidence of diplomatic contact and a deliberate policy of regime change. Now, the missing piece of all of this, which Roman sources downplay considerably, is that Heraclius could not have put the necessary pressure on Iran that he did without the military backing of the great Asiatic power of the day, which was the Turks. He formed an alliance, a military and marriage alliance. His daughter was given in marriage with the so-called the chief of the Western Turks. And this Turkish force smashed its way through the Sasanian defenses in the Caucasus. They besieged the city of Tiflis and continued to wreak havoc in the Caucasus and just destroying Sasanian defenses there. That that basically the northern Iranian position, the Iranian strategic position in northern Iran was completely destroyed and open to the steppe. And at that point, there was simply nothing left to do but put a stop to the war, for fear of total annihilation at the hands of the Turks. Now, this comes from the knowledge of this is alluded to in somewhat brief manner in Roman sources. Simply noted that an alliance was formed. But there is an Armenian source attributed to someone called Moses Daskuransi, who describes in detail the Turkish involvement at the end of this war, which is, I think, quite very obvious that this comes from not necessarily an eyewitness account, but a contemporary account of the Turkish and Roman alliance and what they did. What we also have, a fascinating piece of information, is that the Tang Annals, the so-called New Book of Tang, a Chinese source that takes an interest in the affairs of the steppe and describes the doings of the Turkish steppe empire. The New Book of Tang attributes the fall of the Sasanian state exclusively to the Turks. There's not even a mention of Roman involvement or any kind of alliance. And it even goes further to say that the Turks, the Turkish leader, personally killed Khosrow II, installed his son as ruler, and left a deputy in Ctesiphon to sort of manage, supervise the state. Now, I don't think that that's true. I don't think it can be corroborated. It's sort of fascinating to contemplate as to why this appears in a Chinese source. It must represent at least some form of the Turkish perspective on their their involvement in Iranian affairs. But the key fact, and it's probably subject to some exaggeration, but the key fact is that the Turkish, the effect of involving the Turks in this war cannot be overemphasized, but Roman sources specifically downplay it. So without their involvement, it is arguable that Heraclius would never have succeeded.
Well, cannot be overstated in a modern assessment, but well, clearly the Romans did at the time.
They did, and probably, I mean, Heraclius to this day is remembered as a kind of, semi mythical hero, and he gets all the credit for. I mean, and even now it seems like a daring mission, but the credit rests. The credit is given exclusively to him because he commissioned, many of the accounts that have come down to us and which were used or recycled in other things. So, history written by the victors.
So to wrap both this up and indeed to wrap up the Sasanian Empire, despite some extraordinary success against the Romans, and despite no longer really having the Turks in sort of allied with their enemies, they seem to crumble quite quickly when the Arab invasion happened. So why was that? And I think in turn, sort of final question being, after that, what was the Sassanid legacy?
I agree with the idea that it seems as though the Sasanian state collapsed quickly. It seems that way. But, like rhetorically, I would say, did it really? Was it, I mean, obviously it collapsed, but was it fast? The fact is that the Sasanian state put up a much stronger resistance than the Roman one did in Mesopotamia, Syria, and despite some reverses, the Sasanian state kept regrouping and coming back, for the attack, and even after the fall of the capital, the occupation of the capital, various regions of the empire continued to fight on. I just described this sort of region by region in the book, and Eastern Iran itself. Basically, the further east you go, the less the less secure Arab rule, ever really was. That Eastern Iran was never properly subdued. Parts of the Caucasus remained, refractory, and there's of course the question about what it really meant to capitulate to the Arabs. That in many cases, locals simply agreed to pay the tribute, and then they were sort of left alone. So was that really does that really constitute an occupation or a conquest? It could be argued either way. I mean, I think I side with the idea that it was a conquest, but it was, in many cases, it was not particularly bloody or aggressive. In some cases, it was, but not everywhere, not always. The big reason why the Arab conquest was permanent, though, despite several regions continuing to fight back and capitulating one year and then renewing the fight the next. The real reason why the conquest was permanent is that the Persian capital was seized very early on. The king and his associates fled, and the king was killed, and his descendants fled to China. So, with the occupation of the capital and the virtual extinction of the extinction is maybe not the right word, the humiliation of the Sasanian family, there was really nothing left to carry on, and Iran, or the old Sasanian state, sort of broke down into its regional. It broke down regionally, and each area and local power was left to sort of make its own terms with the conquerors. This is obviously a contrast with the Roman Empire, whose capital was not taken by the Arabs. The provinces were held, but the state continued to move on. If Ctesiphon had been somewhere else, maybe further east or something, the fate of the Sasanian Empire might have been very different. But the other, we have to look at the circumstances, the state that the empire was in right before the conquest. That after the fall of Khosrow II, you have, it's debatable, or it's sort of questionable as to who is responsible for doing this. But all the sources say that all the male children, all the sons of Khosrow II, but one, were killed. And then his successor, whose name was Shiruya, he died of an outbreak of the plague after a reign of not even a year. So the prestige of the Sasanian house never really recovered, and from that moment on, from the death of Khosrow II on, you have sort of various factions and noble parties constantly sort of vying for supremacy. So you have a sort of state of civil war, which, as I say before, was arguably exacerbated by the division of the supreme military command into four parts, and this would have created a situation which was very difficult to mount, a coordinated defense from the center, and would have got harder. I mean, they did it. It was hard, but they did it. But it became harder, if not impossible, after the king had fled. The death of the last king, Yasgard III, is a matter of some legendary embellishment, but the consensus of the sources is that he attempted to flee into the steppe, possibly making his way to China after sending word to the Tang emperor for help, and was killed in a plot in the in or near the city of Marv in eastern Iran. So once we reach that point, the rest of Iran is more or less left to its own devices to defend itself or to make peace with the invaders, and there's no possibility of a Sasanian pretender coming back to rally the empire against them. The son of Yasgard III and some noble Persians do actually flee to China, and they establish themselves at the Tang capital, Chang'an, and the emperor treats them respectfully, and they seem to they seem to become respected members of the Tang court for some time. And there's evidence of a few plans to try to dislodge the Arabs and reclaim Iran, but they never really come to anything. And eventually these plans are abandoned, even though there would have been, like we seem to have a portrait here of a sort of court in exile. Life may have carried on, as close to the way it was before as they could manage. But eventually the plan to retake Iran is abandoned. And the last monument we have to any Iranian or Sasanian person in China is a tombstone of the Surain family. The Surain patriarch had buried his young daughter, and there's an inscription in Chinese commemorating her. This is from the late 8th century, I believe, and very gradually, by degrees, the last of the Sassanians sort of become absorbed within the Tang aristocracy, and that is basically the end. However, in Zoroastrian scripture, there are some relics of sort of myths of this idea of a Sassanian savior coming from the east to rescue Iran from the Arabs and so forth. And I would wager that this is basically inspired by a popular and legendary understanding of the Sassanian court in exile. So that is the end. We're no longer in the Sassanian period. It's now an Arab empire, and for the first century or so, there is no particular effort to maintain the traditions of old Iran or anything like that. The survival of the Persian language would have been in doubt, in much the same way that Coptic is no longer spoken in Egypt. Aramaic is no longer widely spoken in the Near East. It's now Arabic. Much the same fate could have the Persian language could have suffered much the same fate, but eventually the first Arab caliphate was overthrown by the so-called Abbasid Caliphate, and the Persian culture and traditions and language began to be revived, and from there we have a sort of uh, steady revival, and suddenly in the late ninth century, we have the rebirth of Persian poetry, which remains a great sort of cultural touchstone to this day. And although it's a new form of the Persian language, and it has borrowed many Arabic words and is written in a form of the Arabic script, that ultimately its imagery, its sort of high literary illusions, all go back to the Sasanian era. The Sasanian kings are one of the favorite subjects of the poets of later eras, and the Abbasid caliphs are very obviously modeling themselves on the stagecraft and sort of semi-legendary examples of the Persian rulers. And to this day, I would say, I mean, there's no caliph anymore, but the Iranian world is still very much one of its sort of pillars, if you will, is the last great the empire before Islam, the Sasanian Empire. In much the same way, it exerts. You might be able to compare it to, the the way European humanists at the Renaissance looked back to the Roman world, or the Charlemagne and his successors were inspired by the example of imperial Rome, but even arguably even more so in the Iranian world, since this was the last period of Iranian greatness before the coming of Islam. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
No, that both being able to go on and stopping there seem quite reasonable. So, is there anything that we didn't cover that you felt like we ought to go into just a little bit?
Well, I feel as though I've sort of pontificated too long, but the only thing that I would say is that I hope that I guess I don't like the idea of writing a book because I think that I've finally settled the topic. I hope that other people take it up and express their own perspective on it. And I don't want to have the last word on it, because it's been more than 150 years since the first time someone wrote about this in English, and my book is one of very few, so we need more. And I hope that this is only the beginning.
That's a nice note to end on. Well, thank you for being on.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.